Paul Murphy to...
Yeah, sharing time with Mick Barry, half and half, 10 and 10.
To move the motion.
And I move the motion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Last Count Corla. A huge crisis is hitting and about to hit hundreds of thousands of households across the country. That's the crisis of soaring energy bills, electricity, gas, heating oil. For many people, they're going to be faced with the choice that they pay to heat their home properly or they put food on their table. That's the choice that is faced by maybe 1 in 6, 1 in 5 households in this country, because that's the number of people who struggle to pay their heating bills. And now, with the heating bills rising, they're going to be put under even more pressure. This is an international phenomenon, no question about it. There is an extra edge here in terms of the data centres, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But other governments in Europe, far from being socialist governments, but under pressure from below, in Spain, in Italy, for example, have moved to take some action to defend some sections of their population from this increase in prices, to shield them from this increase, to shield them from that choice of buying food or heating their home. But this government proposes to wring its hands, say how bad it is, and then, according to the government's own counter-motion, propose literally nothing to alleviate the burden facing people, but to reassure people that in the long term, competition between suppliers is an important means of exerting downward pressure on electricity prices. So don't worry, neoliberalism, capitalism will sort it out in the long run. Energia recently announced their third price increase of the year. In total, they have increased electricity prices by 45% and gas prices by 42% in the last 12 months. That's over €800 for the average household. Other companies have done something similar. And what is the government planning to do about it? In fact, not only are they planning to do nothing in terms of addressing the crisis, next week, the government is planning to announce a further 22% increase in the carbon tax. With 1 in 5 already having to cut back on light and heat for their homes due to the costs, the government is planning to add to the problem, driving even more into fuel poverty. The carbon tax does nothing to help people reduce their fuel bills or their carbon footprint. Our motion today says, at the very, very, very least, it should not be increased any further in this year's budget. In reality, it should be scrapped and it should be replaced with a pollution tax on those who are responsible for pollution, i.e. the profits of the big business polluters, the data centres, big agribusiness, fossil fuels, and so on. It is time to tackle the profiteering and the power of the private energy companies. The government likes to pretend there is basically nothing they can do in the face of market forces driving energy prices up. But actually, they can do something extremely simple, and they could literally do it today. Literally at the stroke of a ministerial pen, they can declare an emergency in the supply of electricity, in the supply of energy, and then another stroke of a pen can set a maximum price to protect people from these rises. The government has in its power today the capacity to put an end to these energy price hikes. The truth is that the greed of big energy companies has added fuel to the fire of rising energy prices in this country. Privatisation has not delivered the promised affordability and efficiency. It has been a complete disaster. Energy prices in Ireland were already 23% above the EU average prior to this crisis. Across the globe, we see that energy price hikes are highest in states with privatised networks. Investment in improving services and switching to renewables have not happened. Instead, we've had bloated marketing and managerial budgets, as well as large profit margins driving up prices. Instead of actually improving services for ordinary people, privatisation has made life more difficult, with customers every single year having to spend hours researching to try to find the best prices, adding one other unnecessary task to already overburdened lives. The privatisation experiment is a failure from the point of view of workers, from the point of view of ordinary householders, and crucially from the point of view of the environment. As part of a socialist Green New Deal, we should bring the energy sector fully back into public ownership, cut out the profiteering, and create thousands of decent jobs, investing in a rapid and just transition to 100% renewable energy. Instead of that Green New Deal, this government is overseeing a dirty old industry. This year has seen the coal-fired Money Point station actually ramp up production. The Greens get into power and our use of coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, actually increased. It is one of the most environmentally destructive sites in the entire country. The fact that we are almost 1/4 of the way through this century and still reliant on coal energy plants is testament to the abysmal failure to invest in renewable energy production. Our usage of tidal power and offshore wind power is still minimal compared to similar-sized countries such as Denmark. Instead of the profits in the energy sector being reinvested into renewables, they have been siphoned off by profit. Public ownership of the energy sector would allow us to direct all resources to that just transition and shut the likes of Money Point for good. In relation to the fuel allowance, the government in its counter motion simply references the current level. It's a payment of €28 per week for 28 weeks to over 370,000 low-income households, i.e. a majority of those who are going to be hard hit, who are going to be faced with difficult choices in energy prices, do not currently avail of fuel allowance, i.e. the level of fuel allowance is inadequate. Again, there's something very simple that can be done in relation to that, is to increase the fuel allowance by the level in which energy prices are rising, €15 a week, and extend eligibility to mean that all those who are suffering, all those precisely who are faced with that choice, have the ability to avail of the protection afforded by it. Obviously, a crucial reason that we are hit so hard by energy price rises is the very poor state of our housing stock in terms of very poor levels of energy efficiency. And the government's plan, and they haven't met their targets in their plans yet so far, are completely inadequate. We should be aiming to completely retrofit all of our public buildings and all public homes, all local authority approved housing body homes by 2030. Instead, the government's target was for retrofitting 2,400 social homes in 2021, out of a total stock of over 160,000. Again, retrofitting ordinary people's homes is a very good example of the kind of policies that make up an eco-socialist Green New Deal. Things that simultaneously improves people's lives for the better, while also tackling the environmental crisis. I just want to finish again on the point of privatisation, because I do find it quite incredible that the bottom line point of the government's counter-motion is that competition between suppliers is an important means of exerting downward pressure on electricity prices, i.e. continue to let the market rip, and eventually that will help ordinary people. There is no evidence for that. I gave the example previously of the difference between European countries with privatised versus non-privatised markets and the difference in prices. Non-privatised is better. Look at the example of Ireland. The development of the ESB was an historic development. You had nationalisation of 300 expensive, badly run, inefficient private and local authority undertakings. This is from an article by Sinead Mercier. It was described at the time by a newspaper as the first fruits of Bolshevism in the country, but it was enormously successful. Whenever it was privatised, the ESB was forced to artificially increase its prices to attract competitors into a new energy market that the states had spent millions in creating. The exact same story is seen internationally, where, for example, in Australia, there was a study that found that price rises have been highest in states with privatised electricity markets. Continuing the reliance on markets, privatisation is a disaster, again, from the environment's point of view, from workers' point of view, and from ordinary householders' point of view.
Deputy McBarrett.
Well, Count Ceola, I am acutely aware when we discuss this topic that we are quite literally talking about matters of life and death. Because if the government continues to refuse to intervene boldly to protect people from energy price rises, not only will big numbers of households have their budgets severely eaten into, but people will die. And that is not, hyperbole coming from these benches. There is such a thing as excess winter deaths. Now, I've been trying to get my head around the concept of excess winter deaths in preparation for this debate. As I understand it, what it involves is looking at the number of deaths that take place in the state for a period of months, basically December to March, and comparing it to comparable periods, comparable periods in terms of time, not comparable periods in terms of temperature and cold weather, and seeing how many extra deaths there are. And the numbers go up and down in any given year, but they generally tend to be between 1,500 and 2,000. Now think about that. That is shocking. For women, it tends to be a bit more deaths as a result of respiratory issues. For men, it tends to be a bit more death as a result of cardiovascular issues. But the end result is the same. This is an issue overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly affecting elderly people. If you are elderly, you are 7 times more likely to be hospitalised in a cold snap during those winter months than if you're aged 18 to 44. If you are poor, you are 2.5 times more likely to be hospitalised in that period than someone who comes from one of the wealthiest communities. So these are issues that affect a broad swathe of people in society, but is overwhelmingly concentrated on people who are older and people who are poorer, who suffer not merely from the cold weather, not much we can do about that, they suffer from fuel poverty. And fuel poverty is an issue here, and it is a matter of life and death. And to put it in a little bit of context, the Northern Ireland Troubles, which played out over a period of decades, more than 3,500 people lost their lives in the Northern Ireland Troubles. So that number would be overtaken in the space of a couple of years by the excess winter deaths that we have in this country, by the way, the highest in Europe, Minister, as a result of fuel poverty, which is a legacy of capitalism, and it's a legacy of successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael-led governments, even though they might include the Green Party as a decoration in this one. And to show that these problems are man-made, let's take a case example. The ESB, hugely successful company, state company, company which kept prices low for decades, in large measure in order to facilitate the industrialisation of this country. After 1958, when Lamass and the governments, etc., wanted to get foreign direct investment in, the selling point wasn't the corporation tax necessarily at that point. The selling point was a number of things, but cheap electricity was a big part of it. The ESB was a not-for-profit company up until 2001. But in 2001, that changed. It ceased to be a not-for-profit company. Who was in power? Fianna Fáil and the PDs. Were they under pressure from the European Union's neoliberal regulations? Yes, they were, but they embraced it with enthusiasm. And the private operators began to come into the market. And to be clear about what happened there, the ESB was no longer not-for-profit because the private operators couldn't compete with the low prices being charged by the state company. So the state company's prices had to rise in order to let the private operators into the market. And in they came. And then there was another round of deregulation in 2011, and we were told that the ESB would now be able to compete with the private operators, and that if people shopped around, competition would drive profit down. It did in me neck. Prices were below the European Union average in this country up to 2011. By quarters 3 and 4 of can't read my writing here, of 2019, prices of electricity 11% above the EU average. Prices of gas here 12% above the EU average. The ESB's operating profits for 2019, 682 million. For 2020, 616 million. Combined profit over a mere 2 years, 1.3 billion euro. Now imagine if we turn back the clock to 2001 and the ESB was a not-for-profit company, and you used not even all of it, but a significant portion of that 1.3 billion euro to cut prices of electricity. You would cut it. You would cut it by some serious amount. So the problem here, yes, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael governments, Greens in government, but what they're presiding over, the market. Market madness is what we're dealing with here, and what needs to be tackled. So can anything be done? Well, some steps have been taken, not nearly far enough, but some steps have been taken under pressure from below by governments in Greece, Italy and Spain. What happened in Spain? VAT was cut from 21% to 10%. Tariffs on bills were cut from 5% to 0.5%. No disconnections for 10 months. A levy on power plants of 2.6 billion euro and the break given to the consumers. I don't believe that goes far enough. There are people in Spain who don't believe that goes far enough. I understand the rank and file of the Podemos organisation, with the support of some of their MPs, thinks that there should be a national public energy company. In other words, not just tax concessions, but public ownership. Contrast that to the pitiful response of the government in this state. Absolutely pitiful. You're leaving people prey to the ravages of market forces, and Minister, people in this country, mainly elderly people, mainly poor people, will die as a result of your policies. That's a fact. So are you going to change them? And you might throw up your hands and say, what can be done? Well, this motion spells out pretty clearly some steps that can be done. One, by the way, that we omitted to mention, a sin of omission, and I'll say it here. There should be a complete ban on electricity disconnections. There were 1,000 electricity disconnections in this country in 2019, 400 gas disconnections in 2019. That has to be knocked on the head. 0. We need maximum prices. The Minister has the power to do it with legislation that's in place. In any case, if he declares an emergency, he should declare an emergency. We need to abolish the carbon tax. And if you're not prepared to abolish your precious carbon tax, at least freeze it for this year. The fuel allowance needs to rise. We're suggesting €15. It's quite a modest figure, but €15 as a minimum. It needs to be extended for an extra 4 weeks. It should be available to all social welfare recipients. The ESB should go back to being a not-for-profit company. The energy sector should not be run by private business on a for-profit basis. It should be run on a public basis for the needs of all and for the needs of society. We've had enough of this market madness. We've had enough of this precarity and this shadow that is hanging over so many homes in this country coming into the winter, with the threat of energy prices, including the threat of illness and possibly death for many people as well. It must be ended with bold, radical policies, socialist policies of that kind. I want the Minister to respond to the specific proposals, in particular to the proposal that he's been a champion of in terms of the carbon tax. How the hell can you increase carbon tax on the scale that you're planning to do this year with people facing this crisis hanging over them?
Thank you, Lascan Corla, and thank you, deputies. And I will immediately respond to Deputy Barry's question about increases in carbon tax and, where should that money go? So it's government policy that any increase in carbon tax should be ring-fenced and should go directly towards alleviating any negative effects on people who can't afford the increases in the price of energy. And that means that half of all the increases in carbon taxes should go towards retrofitting energy efficiency for homes. A third goes towards increases in welfare, and the remainder goes towards increasing the income of people in farming. And I think that is right. It's also government policy that the distribution and the transmission of electricity should remain in state hands. It's a natural monopoly. There is major investment and operation and activity from state-owned companies in the generation of electricity in Ireland. Around 40% of electricity generated in Ireland is generated by state-owned companies. So I want to thank deputies for raising these important matters and for allowing us time to discuss them today. Clearly, the current situation, where we're witnessing significant increases in international gas prices and their knock-on effects in the Irish market, is a matter of serious concern to the Government. The Government fully accepts that recent electricity and gas price increases will make it difficult for consumers to meet their bills, especially in the current economic environment. Today, in speaking on our amending motion, I will deal with substantive elements of government policy and household supports for energy costs. First, I'll set out the global developments that have affected Irish energy prices. I will then set out for deputies the functions of the independent regulator, the Commission for Regulation of Utilities, the CRU, in relation to these matters, including in highly relevant activities in consumer protection and monitoring competition. And then, lastly, I will set out for you the amendment that I've tabled to this motion. So as part of describing our amendment, I'll outline what government is doing in terms of providing significant supports for household energy costs, both in terms of energy efficiency and welfare supports. It's important to recognise that these price increases are not government or even regulatory decisions. This is because price regulation ended many years ago. Suppliers compete with each other on prices, and they set their own prices accordingly, as you'd expect. So first, let me outline what has been happening in world energy prices. Increases to wholesale energy prices following rises in international gas prices have been the principal driver of these increases. These increases have been felt across Europe. They're not just an Irish phenomenon. Those prices reflect the costs that suppliers face, including wholesale gas costs. The most immediate factor affecting electricity prices in Ireland is the upward trend in international gas prices. In Europe, wholesale natural gas prices have been on an upward curve since the second half of 2020. And this feeds directly through to retail electricity prices, as the wholesale price of electricity correlates strongly with the price of gas. Various commentators, including the International Energy Agency, have stated that both demand and supply factors have contributed to a tightening of the European gas market. Such factors including increased demand due to post-COVID recovery, supply constraints in Europe and increased demand in Asia. European gas reserves are low, and what was used during winter 2020 was not replenished in the summer months. The ongoing need to replenish these reserves means higher gas imports, and this has fostered competition between Europe and Asia for supplies, and thus a further increase in gas prices. As previously stated, all European markets are experiencing these price increases. Deputies will further appreciate that we face additional costs due to our geographic location, our fossil fuel dependency, the small scale of the Irish market, and our low population density, and of course exchange rate fluctuations. I'll now turn to the regulatory role of the CRU. Deputies should be aware that the CRU, the independent energy regulator, has a wide range of economic and customer protection responsibilities in this area. And as part of its statutory code, the CRU has consumer protection functions, and it monitors energy retail markets to ensure that competition continues to develop to benefit the consumer. The CRU also oversees non-price aspects of competition and has taken and continues to take steps to increase transparency and consumer engagement in retail markets. This includes, for example, developing various codes of practice, setting out customers' rights, and found in the supplier's handbook. Additionally, the CRU certify price comparison websites, they lead the smart metering rollout, and they participate in initiatives like the supplier-led voluntary energy engage code, where suppliers will not disconnect a customer who is engaging with them. I note that the CRU recently appeared before the Joint Committee of the Oireachtas, to whom it is accountable. And thirdly, let me now turn to our amendments to the motion. The amendment acknowledges that international energy prices have been increasing and that these increases are having knock-on impacts on households. The amendment also asks that the Dáil Éireann note that Ireland faces particular challenges in this regard, as we are a price taker on international markets, and that Irish electricity and gas prices have historically been higher than other EU countries due to long-standing drivers such as geographical isolation, dispersed population, fossil fuel dependency and small market scale. The amendment upholds the government's conviction that the best long-term approach for Ireland is to insulate consumers from volatility on international wholesale energy markets, to invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and to expand interconnection with Europe and neighbouring markets, and to deepen the internal market in energy. The amendment notes that carbon pricing is an essential element of any credible plan to decarbonise the economy, and furthermore, government's increasing ambition for renewable electricity to reach at least 70% by 2030, and the commitment to greenhouse gas emissions reduction of 51% by the end of the decade. I want to highlight the parts of the amendment that deal with the extensive government supports that are in place. The amendment further affirms the government's support for energy efficiency, where supports are considerable, with a total retrofit budget of €280 million. This funding will mean that more households can receive free energy efficiency upgrades, making their homes warmer, healthier and cheaper to run, in line with the programme for government. The amendment states that government's commitment via the government's Project 2040 National Development Plan provides for an expanded investment well in excess of €1 billion in retrofit between now and 2025. The amendment upholds support for a deepening competition between suppliers as an important means of exerting downward pressure on electricity prices. Customers can and should ensure that they are availing of the best offer in the market by switching supplier or renegotiating with their existing supplier. The amendment further affirms the government's continuing commitment to protect the most vulnerable through extensive supports for household energy costs via welfare schemes, and also the commitment to review the implementation of the strategy to combat energy poverty by the end of the year. The fuel allowance is just one of a range of income supports paid by the Department of Social Protection, which includes general social welfare schemes, the living alone increases to support those living alone and at a higher risk of poverty, and the household benefits package. On the 27th of September, the Minister for Social Protection announced the start of the National Fuel Scheme for the 2021 to 2022 season. A budget of €292 million has been set aside for the upcoming season to pay an estimated 370,000 households. The fuel allowance is available to long-term social welfare recipients and amounts to a payment of €28 per week for 28 weeks, a total of €784 each year from October to April. In launching the winter fuel allowance on the 26th of September, the Minister for Social Protection noted that heating costs are a concern for many, that households have seen their bills increase, and that this would be an important factor as Budget 2022 negotiations continue. The household benefits package consists of a set of allowances which help with the costs of running a household. It includes allowances towards covering electricity or gas costs. Recipients, the majority of whom are pensioners, are paid €35 per month. The Department of Social Protection will spend approximately €195 million this year on the HHB for over 470,000 customers. Targeted supports are also provided under the Supplementary Welfare Allowance Scheme, exceptional needs payments and urgent needs payments, and they may be made to help meet an essential one-off cost which an applicant is unable to meet out of his or her own resources. I'd like to state that all of the funds raised by increases in the carbon tax have been ring-fenced to protect those most exposed to higher fuel and energy costs, and they will be allocated as follows: 1/3 to ensure the increase in carbon tax is progressive through targeted social welfare and other increases to prevent fuel poverty and to ensure a just transition; 1/2 to fund a socially progressive national retrofitting programme targeting all homes, but with a particular emphasis on the Midlands region and on social and low-income tenancies; and the remainder to allocate funding to a REPS2 programme to encourage and incentivise farmers to farm in a greener and more sustainable way. Finally, and importantly, the amendment further commits that the government will provide additional social welfare support in the budget to protect the most vulnerable against fuel price increases. I'd now like to conclude by stating that the government is acutely aware of the financial challenges faced by households due to these price rises, and this government is serious about practical supports. As I've highlighted, government has long provided and will continue to provide practical supports for those struggling with their energy costs. The Government continues to allocate significant funding to these practical supports via the welfare system and through energy efficiency grants and retrofitting. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, are you moving that amendment?
I'm moving the amendment. Thank you.
Moving the amendment. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, next we have Sinn Féin. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 7 speakers. Oh, sorry, people before. Sorry, Deputy. It's actually, it's people before profit, and you have 10 minutes, Deputy Barrett. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, no worries. Minister, to put it very simply and bluntly, energy poverty is going to kill several thousand of our most vulnerable citizens this winter. Climate action, so-called, in the form of the carbon tax, is going to kill many thousands of our most vulnerable and elderly citizens this winter unless you do something about it. And that is what we are appealing for you to do. We've just come out, or we are edging our way out, of a public health emergency where the government, in order to prevent deaths from COVID-19, 5,000 people of whom died tragically as a result of that pandemic and that public health emergency, prompted the government to spend an additional €24 billion in order to prevent, rightly, to prevent deaths in a public health emergency. Now, our motion is asserting that this is a public health emergency in exactly the same way as COVID-19 was a public health emergency and required an unprecedented response in order to prevent unnecessary and needless deaths of the vulnerable. This is a public health emergency. But it's not one that is confined to 1 year. It is an ongoing public health emergency where the sick, the elderly, the older people, the poorer people die as a result of the lack of resources that they have in order to heat their homes. And the government has a responsibility to recognise that public health emergency in the same way as they recognised the COVID emergency, and to make unprecedented efforts in order to ensure unnecessary and needless deaths among our older and more vulnerable and poorer sections of our society. And those who are vulnerable are not a small cohort. St Vincent de Paul estimate 19%, almost 1/5 of our entire population are cutting back on the use of electricity and heating because they can't afford it. And some of those people die as a result. Now those deaths and that hardship and suffering that those who have to turn down the heat and shiver in the cold this winter is the government's responsibility. It is something you can address, but if your counter-motion to our motion is an indication of your response to this, you are clearly not going to address. You're going to allow unnecessary deaths to continue. You're going to fail to recognise that this is a public health emergency, and you are going to allow the vulnerable, the poor and the elderly to suffer, and some of them to die, because you won't recognise how serious it is. And this is a year-on-year public health emergency. But now it has got worse, very substantially worse, and one has to fear, therefore, what will be the potential casualties at the end of the winter season if the government doesn't act, when we are talking about people getting 2, 3 and 4 energy price hikes over the last year, up to €400–500 a year in additional costs for electricity and heating. And overwhelmingly, the cost and the burden of those increases are going to fall on the people who have the least ability to do anything about it. Not only because they are on low incomes, but of course the people who are on low incomes are also disproportionately concentrated in houses where the insulation is extremely poor, where the quality of housing is very poor, and where they have to use disproportionate amounts of energy and heating in order to keep their houses warm. In the case of social housing tenants, they have no control at all over the level of insulation of their homes, because it is up to the local authority and the government to retrofit their homes. And I have to say, Minister, it is nauseating to hear the government in their counter motion and in your speech suggest that the retrofit programme is anything other than pitiful. Pitiful. Last year, the target, Deputy Murphy, in our motion is incorrect, because they're too generous in what you said you were trying to meet. The revised estimates for 2021 showed only €25 million put into the social housing retrofit programme, and the target was 1,670 retrofits, which was not met. It had to be revised down, I think once or twice during the course of the year, because the government and local authorities have spectacularly failed to meet that target. And that's against a total social housing stock of 137,000. Even in the much lauded and trumpeted National Development Plan, the government is only proposing to retrofit 1/4 of the entire social housing stock by 2030. 37,000 homes, as against a housing stock of 137,000. So 3/4 of those who are in social housing will not have their homes retrofitted at the end of the National Development Plan. The amount of investment is pathetic. In terms of the private grants available for private homeowners, the maximum grant you can get is just under €15,000. And not surprisingly, the SEAI's targets for home retrofits were not met either, because of course the actual cost of retrofitting your home is anywhere between 35,000 and up to 70,000 if you want to get to a BER A rating. So the government is failing spectacular and is demonstrating no willingness to actually implement the just transition, which means not unloading the cost of carbon taxes and of climate measures on the people who cannot afford to do it. If you're rich, of course you can retrofit your home. You can manage 70,000. But if you're in social housing, if you're a low-paid worker, if you're a pensioner, how on earth are you going to get 35,000 or 70,000 to retrofit your home when the grants available are about 15,000? You can't do it. You cannot do it. So we need to dramatically increase the investment. And by the way, that would save millions. I haven't got time to set it out. Our proposal in the forthcoming budget is to do 50,000 homes per year, moving up to 100,000, but the savings are absolutely dramatic. We would save about €206 million a year for every 50,000 homes that we retrofit. But in the meantime, until the government steps up to the mark in terms of retrofitting people's homes so they can reduce their heating and energy use, it is absolutely nothing short of punishment to impose further increases in the carbon tax on people who have no control of the level of heat and energy they have to use in their homes to keep themselves warm, and in some cases to keep themselves alive. Okay, so it is criminal to continue to impose carbon taxes on these people. We should not only defer the carbon tax increase, we should reverse. We think we should abolish the carbon tax because it is fundamentally regressive. But if you're not willing to impose it, let me be clear, impose it on the real big polluters, the big agri-beef barons, the big corporations that are responsible for huge amounts of emissions. Impose the taxes on them. Do not impose them on the poor, on the pensioners, on the sick and the vulnerable, which is what you are proposing to do with this carbon tax increase. And again, if you recognise there was an emergency in COVID-19 and you took unprecedented measures and state intervention, levels of state intervention, unprecedented, to match the public health emergency, by God, it is justified to declare an emergency in energy costs and energy supply, and you have the legal mechanisms to do it, to impose maximum unit prices on energy and electricity. Why won't you do it? It is unconscionable if you refuse to do it, Minister. So I seriously ask the government, think again about what you're doing. Have you learned anything from the COVID pandemic about the importance of public health, about we're all in it together? Or are we seriously going to allow continue the obscenity and the scandal of the poor, the vulnerable, the elderly and the sick to die because of lack of heating in their homes and the financial pressures that your government is willing to impose on them through the carbon taxes and through absolutely obscene levels of energy prices by an energy sector that has become completely consumed by profit? And indeed, where the supplies of energy and the price of energy is being driven up by the greed of entities like the big IT companies wanting to build data centres, which you want to facilitate, and they are actually driving up the prices and reducing the level of energy that is available. It shows your priorities. The big multinationals come first, but the sick, the elderly, the poor and the vulnerable will die as a consequence. I appeal to you, withdraw your amendment and support the measures we are proposing in this motion.
Thank you.